You know, it's funny you say that because that's a great segue into our next story, which is about some real mafia-like behavior as well. And that is what's happening in Venezuela, in and around Venezuela, the massive, very significant U.S. forces that have been moved to the region. Obviously, they had the alleged strike against this alleged drug boat off of the coast of Venezuela. And now, you know, Trump continuing to rattle the saber and you know, genuflect towards the possibility of some sort of strike on Venezuela. So to discuss this, we are very honored to be joined here on the show by José Luis Ceja, who's a staff writer at Venezuelanalysis, and also, by the way, a presenter on Sin Muros, who is a great show on Mexico's Canal Once. Thank you so much for being with us, José Luis.
Thank you much for having me. It's always good to be here with you.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's great to have you. And, you know, I saw President Maduro yesterday made a point about this. I think he was being interviewed by Rafael Correa, and he said, it's not really about the cocaine, it's about the oil in terms of what is happening vis-a-vis Trump and Venezuela right now. What do you think about that? How do you evaluate that statement?
Yeah, I think Maduro is absolutely right. This is only the latest in a very long series of efforts to engage in regime change and to oust the government of Nicolás Maduro, which the United States obviously sees as a threat to its hegemony in Latin America. It's very much about the resources as well. It's about Venezuela's oil. It continues to be the country with the largest reserves on the planet, but of course it's other resources as well, which is also gold and rare earths and all the rest of it. You know, the United States is driven by its interests, I think particularly with more recent developments at the world stage, in having Latin America as a place where it can have cheap labor and cheap resources. And Venezuela, as a country that has been through a revolution, the Bolivarian Revolution, having started with the election of Hugo Chavez in 1999, obviously represents a threat to that hegemony. It's also about sending a message to Latin America that the United States will not stop when it comes to its efforts to try to oust governments that it finds inconvenient or a threat to its authority in the region.
You know, we're hearing the U.S. brand Venezuela as this narco-state, right? And Maduro is just this big narco dictator, you know, whatever. How credible is this claim? And what do you think the real purpose of this label is?
Yeah, it's absolutely, there's no credibility to it whatsoever. It's quite disturbing to see the way that they try to manufacture consent for these kinds of actions against the Venezuelan people and towards the Venezuelan government in particular. And, you know, this notion, for example, around Tren de Aragua, right? It's this gang that started in the Tocoron prison in Venezuela. It's been largely eradicated inside of Venezuela. There was a very strong campaign coming from the executive there, from Maduro, to eliminate the influence this organization has. It does have a presence, I think, particularly amongst the Venezuelan migrant communities. They've been heavily involved in some of the human trafficking, but their role is deliberately overstated. The aim is to try to demonize, I think, on the one hand, the Venezuelan people as a whole. We obviously saw massive waves of Venezuelan migrants arrive to the United States as a result of U.S. imperialism, U.S. interference inside of Venezuela, attempts to quite literally destroy that economy. And of course, you know, this effort to try to demonize the Venezuelan population because of their, you know, these large numbers that arrived in recent years, and to justify Trump's mass deportation campaign. But of course, it's also about the regime change. It's also about trying to demonize the Venezuelan government. There is no basis to this allegation that, for example, that Maduro is the head of a cartel. There really is no evidence to speak of, no court-tested evidence to say that this actually even exists. It's that much of a stretch of the imagination. You know, it's something that's being instrumentalized in order to achieve their foreign policy aims. And for example, in the Tren de Aragua, to go back to that, right? It does exist. I'm not going to say that it is a total figment of someone's imagination, but the Tren de Aragua is not the kind of organization, I think, for example, comparable to some of the organized crime groups that you might find in Mexico. This is something that has been overstated. If anything, it's kind of almost like a brand that certain individuals have kind of taken up upon themselves to use to try to advance their own interests as you know, criminal actors in the region. But you know, the disturbing thing is the way that the United States is trying to leverage it. And I think, for example, comments that we've heard from Marco Rubio, you know, just flatly saying, "Oh, it's not the U.S. government. You know, this is an indictment from a court in the Southern District of New York." I mean, there is a reason why that saying is often put forward when we're talking about grand jury indictments. You can indict a ham sandwich if you wanted to. There's really no basis to this. It's Marco Rubio engaging in rhetorical exercises to justify the unjustifiable, because I think it's worth remembering that this strike on this alleged drug boat, it is very clearly, by any definition, a violation of international law. And there was a recent report that actually seemed to suggest that the boat was retreating and that they actually attacked it in order to kill any survivors. And so even if we were to accept some of these outlandish arguments being put forward by the State Department right now, suggesting that they represented an imminent threat, which it probably wasn't, because that boat of that size is not going to make it from Venezuela all the way to the United States. It's quite likely it was headed to a Caribbean island. Well, even if we were to say, okay, it does represent an imminent threat, it was retreating, and the actions that they took clearly are a violation of international law. What we have is a bunch of fanatics running foreign policy in the United States right now.
And I think, that's the fear, especially when they've assembled so much military force, including 10 F-35s moves to Puerto Rico. And talk about the response in Venezuela, because we've seen quite a bit of, I think, discontent with the Trump policy. I've even seen some people who are part of the opposition, express some level of opposition to this move by the United States. So talk about what we're seeing on the ground in Venezuela in terms of the response.
Yeah, of course, we have to recognize that there are various different kinds of oppositions. There's really radical far-right opposition that does exist in Venezuela, but there's also a democratic opposition that recognizes that its role is to provide alternatives to what the government is putting forward in terms of its policies. And, we've seen a response from some of these critics to say that we would not tolerate a U.S. attack on Venezuela. And even some of the left critics of the Maduro government, people who might, consider themselves to be to the left of the government, have said the same thing. They have it quite clear that when it comes to a threat against the Venezuelan territory, to Venezuelan sovereignty, that it's time to close ranks, that this is not tolerable whatsoever. It really is quite useful, I think, in some ways, to see the people who do seem to want to have this kind of attack. It says everything you need to know about what is their vision, what is their understanding of their role inside of Venezuela, and they're basically compradores, right? They are agents of U.S. imperialism. They don't actually have a national interest. They don't defend national interest whatsoever. They are there to put forward and advance the interests of U.S. imperialism. There was actually, this came up in the interview between Correa and Maduro, where in the case of Ecuador, you're also seeing a former president actually call for the bombing of his own country. There's a term we use here in Latin America and in Spanish, vendepatrias, people who sell out their homeland. That's how these people should be understood, because it's quite egregious to even suggest the notion, because the U.S. uses this kind of euphemistic language, surgical strikes and all the rest of it, but there's nothing surgical about it. If they do actually decide to commit an attack inside of Venezuelan territory or any territory in the region, that's going to lead to the deaths of innocents. It's going to lead to bloodshed of people who have nothing to do with it. And even if they are criminal actors, then they should face justice. They shouldn't be assassinated with bombs falling on them from the sky. So be wary of anybody who's calling for that. These are the same voices that I think are also the ones that are so frequently featured in U.S. media as so-called champions of democracy. And of course, I'm talking about people like Maria Corina Machado, who also, important to say, backed U.S. sanctions against Venezuela, which has led to the deaths of, thousands of people. One report found that in 1 year from CIPER, that 40,000 people were negatively impacted in terms of their health as a result of these sanctions. So, these people who call sanctions are also willing to entertain this notion of U.S. unilateral military action inside of the territory. And of course, finally, I would say that you have to reject this in a generalized way, because as much as this is very much a message to Venezuela, the U.S. has made it clear that they don't view Maduro as legitimate, that they're willing to engage in violations of international law in order to put pressure on him. This is a message for the region. This is the United States. I think I am operating under the hypothesis that there seemed to be moving into a period of kind of a strategic withdrawal back into the Western Hemisphere. And so they want to make it clear that under this administration, under this White House, they're willing to do just about anything to ensure their hegemony over this region because they view it in a very kind of specific way. It's a disgusting term, but it's the way that they use all the time, which is as their backyard, right? The return of kind of the ugliest face of the Monroe Doctrine. And I think it's very important from Ecuador to Mexico to Venezuela to Brazil, everywhere, to be very clear that these kinds of actions cannot be tolerated and must be rejected absolutely and completely, because if that precedent is allowed to be established, they will repeat it throughout the region, and that would be devastating for all of the working class people of this region.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought it to that sort of zoomed out context. I mean, really what I think you see in this hitting this drone strike on the boat and then these military threats against Venezuela is the U.S. really entering a phase of just brute force everywhere. It's kind of like the Gaza logic being applied to everything, right? And I imagine that countries around Venezuela, regional allies, and then even ones who aren't allies, would be looking at this and maybe getting a little concerned because that means, the U.S. gets away with this sort of thing. What's the U.S. going to do the next time it doesn't get what it wants from your country? Just going to bomb you? So all that's to say, how are Venezuela's regional allies responding? Countries like Cuba, Bolivia, maybe even Brazil, I don't know, has Mexico said anything? Is there any coordinated pushback?
I think we've seen a very important pushback. I think I failed to mention this earlier. Definitely domestically inside of Venezuela, we've seen the mobilization of millions of people who were already signed up or weren't, decided to sign up and join the Bolivarian Militia as a means of showing their solidarity with the government and to show that they are willing to put their lives on the line to defend their territory. I think that is the absolutely most correct response. I've called it a glorious response to see the people basically turning out to all of the Plaza Bolivars everywhere throughout the country to sign up. And I think it's also important to send a message. But regionally, I think it's also been really encouraging to see, for example, CELAC countries issue a statement to condemn this kind of actions. It wasn't a universal statement, unanimous statement. Unfortunately, there are countries in the region. There's a couple actually in the Caribbean that have been quite worrisome response. Actually, we saw, the governor of Puerto Rico talk about how she's more than happy to see her country used as a launching point for these kinds of attacks. Worrisome statements from Jamaica and from Trinidad and Tobago. But we did see a very strong majority of members of the Community of Latin American and Caribbean states, CELAC, come out and say this clearly. And we did see Lula also actually talk to BRICS countries to say we have to take a position against recent U.S. actions in the region at the upcoming UN General Assembly. So there is, importantly, I think, even from leaders who are seen as, closer to the center than they are to the left, like Lula, making clear, and I think it's exactly what you said. I think there's an understanding here in the region that if we allow this precedent, it could be used as a pressure tactic or a threat against any country, especially the smaller states. The United States really is a bully, and it tries to bully around smaller states. For example, the day that this came out in the news about this attack on this alleged drug boat, Marco Rubio was arriving in Mexico. And a lot of people were speculating if it was also actually a message for Mexico. Mexico has a very strong defense of its sovereignty under the government of Claudia Sheinbaum. It's a red line for this government not to tolerate that. And we saw that Marco Rubio had to, agree to this security arrangement where they not signed, but a memorandum of understanding that they would not violate Mexican sovereignty, for example. But, Mexico has the ability to negotiate that way with the United States, I think in a lot of ways because of the close relationship, the physical proximity, the important trade relationships. Not all countries have that luxury. And so that's why there has to be a very strong position. And shame on all those world leaders who have not spoken out against this, particularly those here from the region who refuse to sign on to that statement. You can have all the differences you want with Nicolás Maduro and the Venezuelan government, but I think it's very clear that there are certain things that should never, ever be crossed. And then one of them is, of course, respect for sovereignty. We have to understand that this isn't, the 19th or the 20th century where the United States can come around and violate sovereignty in the ways that they have done historically, because that eventually is going to come up against even allies. We've seen it before that the U.S. turns against one-time allies in the region. It is a very short-sighted way of approaching policy with the United States.
Mm-hmm. Well, a lot to all of this, and it's going to be interesting to see how it unfolds. Hopefully the situation will de-escalate quicker than, might be expected given Trump's threats. But we really appreciate you coming on, helping us sort through it all. Jose Luis Granado Ceja, thank you so much for joining us here on The Freedom Side.
Thank you very much for having me.